This is part 2 of the best of the All Things Risk podcast for 2019. Happy New Year, good people. I'm Ben Catania, host of the All Things Risk podcast, and this is the second part of our annual Best of the Year episode. And there's no need for you to go back and listen to the first part to get a lot out of this second part, but I recommend that you do that. Nonetheless, let's get right back into it. We're going to begin with a clip from our conversation with Alastair Humphreys, who decided as his next adventure to learn to play the violin and with his bad violin playing, go and busk around Spain, living off only the earnings he made from playing the violin, as he followed in the footsteps of a hero of his, Laurie Lee, who did the very same thing, subject of a book called As I Walked Out One Midsummer Morning. Here's a clip from Alastair's Midsummer Morning.
Get the same feelings that I used to get from, say, canoeing down a scary river or hiking over a big mountain, trying to get that adventurous feeling in a different kind of way. And yeah, there were lots of ways that I could have got out of this. And I was aware, on the first morning I met these illegal immigrant guys, African guys, who were trying to sell sun hats down on the seafront to get cash. And they were all looking around and cagey because they knew if the police came along, they had to run because otherwise they'd get arrested and chucked in jail or booted out of the country. And so they were properly hustling for their life. So I was very conscious that I was just playing a game here. I was pretending to be poor. I was pretending to be vulnerable. But I think that's actually reflects how a lot of things we do in life are a lot of the time. When we're scared when we, start a new business or something. But what's the worst that will happen? It fails. You look like an idiot. You run out of cash for a bit, and then you'll either get another job, or the worst case scenario, the government will give you some money and some food. We're not dying at the things that we're doing in life, and we tend often to be so afraid of committing to trying stuff, whereas through force of circumstance, those guys trying to sell hats, they are properly living adventurously. I'm sure they didn't want to be, but I think it's an important thing to bear in mind that most of the things that people like me do are just playing games and pretending, and therefore we should have the confidence just to throw ourselves into it as fully as we dare.
Yeah, that's I guess at some level our minds and bodies don't make that distinction, but when you stop and think about it, most of us in the Western world, all of us in the Western world, have access to some type of support that would get us back onto our feet if the worst ever happened. So now I found, before, I think when I set off to cycle around the world, which was very much a frightening decision because it was going a different direction to that in which all my peers were going, in which my family expected and what society expected. So it seemed like a brave decision to do. But I was conscious when I did it that I had a university degree. I had a teaching qualification. I was not going to starve to death. This was, it was worth having a go. Try this big adventure. Try and write books. Try and do whatever. If it all fails, by the end of the week, you'll have a job somewhere. You're not going to die. And so I think having that, the safety net gives me the courage or gives me the confidence to take the jump, I think. That's super interesting. Yeah, it's super interesting on a variety of levels. But one for me is that there's very rarely such a thing as putting everything on the line, like those immigrant hat vendors.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Which I think hopefully then should give us all the confidence a little bit to just go for it, be a bit more bolder in whatever change in our life we might be trying to make, just to give it a go. Certainly that's one of the things that Spain trip was trying to do for myself in my own way. Yeah.
What type of planning did you do other than violin and you had all sort of a bunch of equipment and things with you, a bivy bag, etc. But I guess you're fairly experienced at that. I guess that the sort of sleeping wild and those kinds of things didn't really faze you at all.
No, and that's one of the points of the whole thing. I had to. We could be having, and I have done for a different type of podcast, a totally different conversation whereby you're asking me what kind of rucksack I took and why I chose that rucksack and whether I used hiking boots. For some people, walking 500 miles cross country, sleeping rough every night, having to cook on fires would be a really big deal, a real adventure. But I've been doing that for so long that it for me, packing for that trip would be like you packing to go to your granny's house for the weekend. You just think, I need this, chuck it in a bag, and off I go. So I didn't really give any thought to the actual planning of the hike, the trip, the route, the equipment, and it didn't faze me one bit. And that again reinforced the point that I needed to get a different way of living adventurously in my life, because lovely as hiking through Spain is, I know I can do that. So all of my focus and planning and effort and nerves were purely about standing up in a small sunny village square and playing my violin for 10 people, which for a lot of people who can play the violin would not be at all scary. So it's quite interesting, the different things that preoccupy us when we're planning big projects.
So you had a repertoire of 5 songs, was it?
Yeah, 5 songs that I could play all right, and they reach about 30 seconds long. It was the music syllabus that kids learn at school, grade 1 music syllabus. So I had the 5 songs for that, and then I had a B list of a few more songs which I was really terrible at, but which I could occasionally have a crack at. But it was basically 5 songs plus the opening and closing bars to Bruce Springsteen's Thunder Road, which I wanted to learn from because I like that song.
What were the what were the sort of looks on people's faces when you after doing this for several days? What was when you got to a new town square and you got the violin out and you had a small audience? What was the initial look after the first few notes started to come out?
I think it was surprise, really. Along comes this guy. I don't look Spanish. I was quite dusty from the road. I had a big hiking backpack, so I'm quite an interesting looking guy to turn up in a Spanish village off the tourist trail, get out his violin. It's quite an interesting thing. A wandering troubadour, a wandering minstrel. And then when I'm just playing like a 6-year-old, it was just surprise. A violin sounds pretty bad when it's played badly. So either amusement, a little bit of horror. But I was very worried that people would be unkind to me. That was something that definitely played on my mind. What will people say? Will people tell me to go away? These sort of childish things were bothering me in my 30s. So I was really nervous about what people would think. But although most people ignored me, as they always do with buskers, and some expressed surprise or amusement, basically no one was unkind, which I think is also interesting. I think we think so often that the whole world is looking at us. For example, if you, get on the bus with your t-shirt inside out for some reason in the morning, when you realize you're mortified, think, everyone's been looking at me, but almost certainly no one's noticed because we're all just busy with our own lives. So it took me a while to realize that no one really cares what I'm doing. Just do my thing. Everyone else is just going shopping in Spain and getting on with their lives.
Yeah, all of us, or not all of us, but many of us are just in our own worlds. we think that, as you say, everyone is watching us and making judgments all the time, when in fact probably not paying very much attention.
Yeah, exactly. It's called spotlight syndrome. I learned retrospectively
that we think the spotlight's always on us.
Exactly. Right? Yeah. Which is, and once you realise it's not, it's quite liberating. You could walk down the street with your shirt on inside out, and no one will. Well, most people won't notice, or certainly no one will care. And I think the same thing then applies to thinking, right, I'm going to start a blog or do a photography website or whatever. It's like, seriously, just no one cares. Just get on and do it. And the whole world's not going to suddenly pour scorn on you if you do something unconventional.
Up next is a clip from my conversation with Lloyd Figgins about his row across the Atlantic and his worst day doing that.
So the whole row took us 60 days and 17 hours. Okay, so 60 days, 17 hours. My worst day was day 31. So quite literally the day after the halfway mark. Of course, at the time we didn't know that was the halfway mark. But when we did actually hit the halfway mark, Dave Allred sent a text saying, because we got lots of texts on the sat phone saying, you've done it, you're over halfway, you've broken the back of it. And Dave Allred sent us a text saying, you're probably getting a lot of people sending you messages of goodwill. And he was the only one that recognised that this was probably our lowest moment, and it was. But only Dave and I knew that. And I remember that we'd had a lot of things that happened, massive seas, the shipping, incidents with near misses with shipping. We'd been knocked off our seats in big waves more times than we cared to remember. We'd bruised our ribs, our hands were, calloused and really, really sore. Our butts were a general plague area, and the whole thing was really, really uncomfortable. So we thought we'd actually been through everything. And I remember I'd just come on, Dave had gone into the cabin, and I was making myself a cup of tea early in the morning. And I was having my breakfast, and this wave came and it hit the side of the boat, and it tipped the boat over to the point that I thought, oh my God, we're going over, I'm going in. And just at that point where I thought it's going over, it self-righted. And the one thing I remember about it was that the ocean had spilt my cup of tea that I'd just made. And I went mad at the ocean. And I swore at the ocean, and I called it all the worst names under the sun. And for the rest of that day, I wouldn't speak to the ocean. I wanted nothing to do with the ocean. I hated the ocean. And yet, that evening, I made peace with the ocean again. But that was my lowest point, and that was just after the halfway mark. And that was the worst thing that really happened to me. Was I had a cup of tea down situation. And I even refused to make another cup of tea. To myself, and I'd said to the ocean, see what you've done? No, I'm not going to have another cup of tea just so you can spill it. And I think to me that, when I reflect on that, I do think that it was indicative, it was a release of the things that we'd been through. I needed to have that moment. And then everything after that was absolutely fine. And, nature's got a really good way of showing you how powerful she is. That wave was an example of that, and yet that night we had such a clear night that I looked up, I saw the Milky Way, and it was as if I could reach and touch the Milky Way. And I thought, you can't buy this. There's nothing in life that gives you this. And so you out of adversity, you get to realise that you're such a small part of this incredible planet. And the one thing that came out of the whole exercise was we really need to look after our planet a little bit better. In fact, a lot better. And the oceans are the key to that. And I've worked with a lot of conservation organisations, both before, during, and after that row. To make sure that we do everything we can to protect our planet, and this is why we talk about risk, but in the work that I do on a day-to-day basis with the trip group and everything else, it's really important that people do go and travel and they do go and push boundaries, because if they don't, we lose our identity and we lose our knowledge of why we're actually here as human beings and our part in the larger ecosystem of the planet. And it is so important. And if we sit looking at screens or at, at phones or laptops or whatever, we don't get that. We can't get it unless we're actually out there and we're actually doing it. And everybody has their own risk appetite. And I'm not encouraging people to go and row an ocean if that's not what they want to do. But get outside, walk in your local park, and start to actually understand, the planet that we're on, and that we owe something to that planet. So rowing the ocean gave me that, a really loud wake-up call as to the things that are important in life.
That's very beautifully put. Did you see evidence of the plastics in the ocean and things that you hear about?
No, we didn't. And I have to be really honest about that. I know other ocean rowers have, said that they saw plastic and they saw waste and so on. We didn't, I'll be honest. But part of that, I think, is because you're very low when you're rowing an ocean, so you haven't got the sort of the field of vision that you would have if you were on a ship or something, or even a yacht. So we didn't, but we did research into the marine life that we saw, including some seaweeds and so on. But it was a small contribution. But when we fed that back to the various marine organisations, they were so thrilled, because we even saw a pod of a very, very rare species of dolphin, which is called a pygmy killer whale, although it's a dolphin. And we saw a pod between 8 and 10 of these things. And that was the first sighting they had of these things in a number of years. And the populations of pygmy killer whales have really, really diminished. They are on the red list. And so for us to actually be able to give a confirmed sighting of them and pinpoint where it was through a GPS was gold dust to them. So, for us, there was that contribution that we were able to add.
Up next is a clip from my conversation with award-winning author Tikiri Herath. Tikiri's fiction books often feature women or girls as the protagonists, and in this wonderful clip, it will give you a little bit of an understanding as to why.
I went to British schools, so I got this little bubble of Western education, but I lived in an Eastern home, but my environment was from Africa or somewhere else. So I just realized, though, everywhere I went, women were treated differently, and especially in very traditional cultures. And as a girl, if you told me, Tikiri, you're going to eat second because you're a woman, or you're going to go out through the back door because you're a woman, or you're going to, I start to, it really bothers me because, and this is as a young girl, I grew up living right next to South Africa, which was under the apartheid regime at that time. Mandela was in prison, and I had friends in my class who were ANC. They were, I don't know if they're not refugees as much as they were exiled themselves.
Like dissidents.
Right, dissidents. And the kids would come to my school. So I would sit next to girls and boys whose parents were either shot dead in front of the parliament just for asking to vote. So till this day, I will vote. You'll have to shoot me 10 million times before I get to the voting booth. It's so important to me because of what I saw. Why am I telling you this? Is to show that that all these different places where I went to, women, though, were always secondary. And then I always compare that, what seems in some traditional cultures to be almost accepted. It is the way it's always being done. And I'll tell you a few specific examples, but in general, when you look at how women are considered second class in all the different ways, and then I turn around and people go, ooh, apartheid is a terrible thing and we need to stop it. And then we did stop it, and we cannot, racism is bad. We've all agreed to that. I'm not saying it's eradicated. We do have issues and there's still lots of work to be done, but there's common agreement. And I'm going to say something very controversial now. People are very quick to put the race card on the table. Yet when it comes to gender, we excuse it, we let it happen in the name of culture and tradition. And that, Ben, is when my blood boils, because whether you tell me as a human being to go to the back of the bus because I'm a girl or because of the color of my skin, the way I feel will be the same. You'll make me feel as that horrible feeling of not being up to snuff, not to being your equal. I don't care for what reason you tell me to go to the back of the bus, but that makes me feel bad. And I'll give you one example. I hope your audience isn't too squeamish, but when a girl gets a period in most Asian countries, and this is prevalent, I think mostly in the subcontinent of Asia, in Bangladesh, India, Sri Lanka, and I was subject to this. They send you away for 7 days to a dark room, and you're not allowed to see anybody. What? I was 9 years old, and here I've been reading and I've been traveling, and this is when I went back to Sri Lanka, and here I am, I like you, I sponge information, and I'm learning about the world, and all of a sudden my life changed because biologically I was growing, I was changing, and that's just a normal part of human. That's just part of being a human, being a female. And all of a sudden, I was banished to a small dark room in a little shed, and I was told I cannot see anybody, I cannot talk. I was given a little broth every day because that's what tradition says that you have to eat. And when I asked, of course, me being me, I fought back and I said, why can't I get out there? What's wrong with me? And all of a sudden I was told, you are no longer a girl, you're a woman, and that idea of your second class, you're no longer can run around and play with everybody. You have certain restrictions now. And the reason I was given for not being able to get out, and for 7 days that I was stuck in a dark room without being able to see or talk to anybody, except for that my aunt who'd come and throw the bowl of soup and walk away quickly as if I was a leper. The reason they said was because I would, if I got out in that position as getting your first period, that if a man saw me, that I would curse them. This is coming from both my parents had university degrees. One of them had a master's from the UK, and yet they had such a hard time shedding these backward, regressive, harmful traditions. And I was sitting there having done all the reading, and as my brain was and I could argue, right? And I did argue, which meant greater punishment. But so that's just one example of does that make any logical, rational sense? And even from a health perspective, that's the worst thing you can do. That's exactly the time when you need to feed the girl you need iron, you need a whole, whack of good health diet, not a little broth. And mentally, it puts you in a place. It's a way of telling a young woman that you're a woman now, so shut up, sit down, sit back, and you're no longer allowed to climb trees and be that bodacious person that as children we run around, we play. And it's a nice way to shut the little girl up and groom them for that second state in society. And I compare that all the time with the apartheid regime. The blacks had to go in the back door, and I remember going to a temple. This was a few months later, and I was told, one of my female relatives turned around and said, well, you aren't allowed in. And I said, why not? I said, well, you've got your period today, so you can't come in because you'll dishonor the temple. So we're all going in. You just hang out there. And of course, that's what the women did. So I sat in this outside this temple. I looked in, and it was a Buddhist temple of all things, and the irony of a religion that talks about compassion and goodness to all, and how they would treat a young girl as a piece of discarded meat. If I sound angry, I am, because I think that is wrong. And I'm not angry for myself anymore, but I'm angry that it happens to other girls still today in 2019. And Elon Musk talks about sending us to the Mars, and we've got driverless cars, and you and I are communicating through the internet over 2 continents, and yet these barbaric backward traditions exist. And what bothers me even more is I was with parents who were educated to some degree, but they had such a hard time shedding those backward traditions. And it really harms a person. And that's just one example, and I could give you many. I mean, I've met girls who've and I was lucky, I'm not one of them, but many girls who've I was lucky I wasn't married off, right? At 12,
right.
It happened.
Jeez.
I was lucky I wasn't physically or in any other way abused, which happens often in those societies because girls are just a second, that's one of the things I learned about reading the Gulag Archipelago, Man's Search for Meaning, and all those tremendous books that talk about how human beings treat other human beings in the vilest of circumstances is when you want to tell an entire group of people or a section of people that if you want to mistreat them or keep them down, you start with these small little things, right? You start saying like what Hitler did in Germany was a wonderful example. He was an amazing orator. He was a wonderful manipulator. I'm using the word wonderful as in he was very good
skilled
at it.
Sure.
Right, very skilled at it. And so I see in the big macroeconomic political scale, how these happen with groups of people. And then I see that replayed in the home front, in the school front, when it comes to girls. But that seems to be okay.
Let's talk diversity and inclusion. This is from my conversation with Nancy Roberts. So as a risk person, one of the best things you can do is have diversity of opinions. Yeah. Certainly at senior levels throughout the organization, of course, but certainly when there are decisions to be made for all sorts of reasons, to bring different perspectives into what you're trying to do, to avoid groupthink and confirmation bias and all sorts of things. So it's valuable to have a diversity of opinions, certainly at senior levels. Yeah. So why aren't we there yet?
I think we're not there because it takes a degree of personal risk and discomfort to surround yourself with very diverse opinions, right? I mean, you will know this, but in a lot of contexts, you will see, a CEO come in and they will kind of reshape the senior team and they'll bring in their people.
Their people, yeah.
And what they mean by their people is people that they know that they can work with and who kind of have the same sort of ideas and who will support them.
That also happens, in the interviewing phase, right? There's
absolutely.
That sort of first round across any organization you've ever interviewed. It's what's the cultural fit, and that always feels a little bit weird, right?
Yeah.
How would you fit culturally in the organization?
Yeah.
So I guess it happens throughout from senior all the way down.
Absolutely. And of course the problems are compounded at senior level because often those roles are less transparently recruited for, or they're recruited for in certain kinds of ways, either through referrals or through personal connections, again, all of which again disadvantages women, for example, disadvantages ethnic minorities who are less likely to have those networks. And it tends to be less transparent. There's not necessarily a formal structured interview process that everybody can observe happening and know that it's fair. That allows a lot of things that potentially recruiting for a more junior post you wouldn't get away with because it has to be more transparent and, different kind of rules apply, I guess, whether that's explicitly stated or not. I think when I think of sort of leaders in organisations I've been in, most of them will tend to surround themselves with people that they feel comfortable with. And, that's understandable. We're social animals and, you want to enjoy your work and you want to work with people that you get on with. But that's where the risk comes in, I think, because then you do get groupthink. And I've seen that a lot, where it's like violent agreement about an issue rather than someone saying, well, hang on, isn't there another way to think about this? Or maybe we need to get some different points of view in the room. And of course, it's much more comfortable to have a board meeting where everyone agrees. And you all feel good, you've made some decisions and everybody feels good about them and that's great. But of course the quality of the decision then is compromised because nobody's really debated it.
There's also a big concern, that's come up in previous episodes of this podcast around systemic risk and take the global financial crisis, for instance. Pick whatever country, the non-executive directors, they just of the major corporates of that country, they're all the sort of same people that sit on each other's boards, and it's just this community of the same people. Well, how is that going to inject different thinking about some of the big challenges that those companies face.
Yeah, and I think we sometimes underestimate how easy it is to get conditioned by a culture. So, we've all seen it where you join an organisation and you shake things up a bit, coming in maybe at a sort of middle or senior management level. You've been brought in to make some changes and you can see the problems of the organisation very clearly because you have that fresh perspective. But over time...
Right, you start to go native.
You go native. And that's partly because it's easier. But also it's just hard to always be the outlier. And I think over time...
Also training.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's constantly reinforced. So you'll have your performance review and you will be told, well, this is great, but actually, you've upset a few people with this, or you've made some ripples by doing that. So you start thinking, well, is it really worth it? Do they really want me to make these changes in this organisation, or are they kind of paying lip service to it? And you do sort of get institutionalised into a culture, and therefore things which an outsider would find unacceptable start to seem acceptable, and your boundaries change around all of that. And of course the financial crisis is a classic example of that, where you ask the average person if they understood the context, they go, this is mad, these people should not be doing this, it makes no moral or rational sense. But of course if everyone's doing it and they're for a while seeming to be succeeding at doing it and it's benefiting them, suddenly it doesn't seem so bad anymore. So, that's where I get interested, is like, as an organisation, what are you condoning? And what kind of practices might emerge out of that might, hopefully would be really beneficial, but potentially might not be. And how does that put you, as a human in that context? Where do you sit? How do you call that out if you're the person going, actually, I think some of this is wrong, but all the senior people are doing it, people are succeeding through doing these things. Do I just shut up and, fit in? Do I leave? What are my choices? And your choices are often quite limited in that context.
Here's a concept that perhaps we need to discuss more. It's called liquid democracy. This is from episode 104 with Ed Dowding.
Good friend called Joseph Davies Coates, who is the most brilliantly, broadly knowledgeable man, and just full of so many good ideas of how to improve things. He told me about this system called liquid democracy. And so liquid democracy is essentially you get to choose your own representative, or your own representative for different topics. So by default, at the moment, we have our MP or our senator or whoever who takes decisions for us, and once every 5 years we pick between one of 3 or 4 colours that are available to us, and they decide everything for us. And that's okay as a default, but actually, and good job, well done, I really admire the work you're doing, but in health, God, you suck, MP. I do not agree with you in health at all, and I don't understand what is so different about my vision that makes it not integrate with your worldview. But one way or another, you want to privatize the shit out of everything, and I want to keep it, essentially public and high performing in public. I don't see why that's a problem.
But you might agree with a guy on economic policy or foreign policy, or
everything else. Fine. That's take care of that. You're doing at least a good enough job on it, and I don't care enough about those other things because they're not quite as essential. So on health, I want to pick a different representative. Just on things tagged health as they come through the system. Done. Ooh, actually, maybe education as well. Okay, I'm going to give education to someone else. And so you start distributing power between the people that you trust to make better decisions than the incumbent. It's not to displace the incumbent, because obviously we still have a parliamentary system and they're still in charge, but it's to help a society better surface the intelligence from within the crowd and better allocate trust to where it is, as the crowd determines, can be most usefully deployed. And so actually it's really like democracy, but it's just what we would do with democracy if we invented it now. So you can have your default, you can be as engaged as you like, and you can have multiple representatives for different things. We didn't do it because the paperwork would have been a nightmare, but now you can do it really easily. And so, cool, that seems like a fun idea. And so, but I couldn't work out a business model for it. And so I left it, I parked it.
As an aside, I mean, it's so interesting because our democratic institutions are actually they're kind of ancient. And if you think about the U.S. electoral college system, for example, the reason why that exists is because people couldn't get to the same place to vote, so you'd have to get someone on a horse to go and give all the votes to this one place, who would then submit them for the presidency. And this is like 300 years old, 300 plus years old.
Yeah, and it's a really good argument for, to point to for the merits of competition, because it's the one domain in which there isn't competition. There's competition within it, as you have parties competing, but they're both playing exactly the same game within the same system, and it's not allowed to evolve. And of course, over time, it gets increasingly corrupted, in quotes, and whether that's active or passive corruption, just laziness and complacency. We don't need to evolve, therefore why evolve?
Absolutely. What you're talking about is harder to corrupt, I think, because there are too many nodes. Whereas if you have one representative, then you can as a whether it's a lobbyist or whatever, and then you can kind of link policies and do all this sort of horse trading over, well, I'll vote for you on this if
I'd put a flag in that point, and sort of there are ways to game any system. And it's possibly just harder to track the corruption that would happen under a liquid democracy system. Probably doesn't mean that we wouldn't try and corrupt it anyway. Like, there are bad actors all over the place, but one way or another, there's greater transparency and greater potential to fix the problem when it becomes discovered and emerged. And when we fix it, it's not catastrophic. That it's, oh look, there was one bad actor out of 12 different people making a decision for people in health. We replaced them, everything carried on fine, rather than we had a...
So what would that look like in practice? You'd have a representative or representatives for health and others for education and infrastructure. And
so if we apply it to, say a normal government model, you would be... So you could go on there, you could run... Essentially, you could create a sort of simplified House of Commons. Here is a bill going through Parliament. This is what your MP, or these are the fundamental questions, delivered in plain English, nice and accessible. These are the fundamental questions going on this bill. What do you think about them? If you want to say what you think about them, you can vote and you can participate and you can find out how you compare with everybody else. If you don't, that's okay. Your MP is taking care of it. That's your default. Over time, as you answer more and more of these questions, you then go, oh, actually, on health, we do disagree. We're in the red zone on our agreement, but I can see with this person, I'm in the green zone. So I then, there's an interesting little nuance here that's quite fun to talk about, that you don't actually delegate your vote to anybody, so you don't put pressure on anybody. Like, if you suddenly found that you had 200,000 votes for geopolitical issues, like, shit, like, you might have the deciding vote on whether we do or do not go and bomb whichever country we're bombing today. But what happens is that you copy that person's vote by default instead. So it's still your vote, you still have responsibility for it, but you're just taking their advice. So if we had a conversation in the pub and you said, I think we should do this, I would go home and vote that way anyway. It's just a way of automating that process. Right? But it takes the pressure off everybody, and it also makes it less vulnerable to corruption, because that person never actually has your vote in the first place. So so then what that then looks like is that you, essentially, rather than having 35 million people going up to 600 representatives in your structural organogram, you have 35 million people going to a couple of 100,000 people, who then in turn probably delegate off their vote to people that they trust who know better. So then you've got 1,000 people, and so within each topic, within each domain. So it's really, like, to draw it out and to map
complex,
it, it's really complex.
We've got
but
the
actually,
data and the systems to be able to do that.
Yeah, and conceptually it's simple. It's just that map it and it gets really complicated.
We now go to a clip from my conversation with StJohn Deakins about data and the origin story of his very innovative company, Citizen Me.
So when I was doing some internet stuff around 2000, I worked on strategy papers for T-Mobile about kind of omni-channel and kind of what we called multiple digital channels, and how everyone was going to be connected to everything. And the mobile phone was going to be at the center of that experience. This is 2000, and kind of figured it was going to be like 2 years away, right? But the iPhone didn't come through until about 96, and that was 2.5G. So really, it kind of took about a decade to come through properly. But that kind of being able to link things together, I know that I have that kind of ability, but then also there's a huge amount of luck as well, right?
And timing,
Timing's massively important. So for this project, I was kind of looking at what the big kind of existential risks were for my kids, who were 7 and 8 at the time.
Okay.
And it's like, so a little bit of hubris. And it's like, okay, what can I do that's really going to change the world for my kids and kind of make the world a better place for them and people like them? And there are 2 big areas, obviously. One is climate change. And there's some really cool stuff around passive solar and solar chimneys and all kinds of stuff like that, and which isn't yet being touched on. But I don't have a background in that. The second big area is how the internet is going to evolve, right? Because as we move in, we're moving out of an industrial era, right? So we've got a lot of businesses at the moment, like ad tech is basically old school ad tech, advertising with a veneer of internet on top. So you've got lots of kind of old kind of businesses which are kind of trying to transition to the internet, but the whole world is going digital. And as the whole world goes digital, if you look kind of maybe 20 years on, the outcome for that is we're all going to live in a world where everything, which seems magical now, but everything just magically happens around us. So I get into my car, and my car automatically knows it's going to be autonomous car. It's going to know where I'm going to go, but it also knows I'm traveling with my daughter, so to play maybe a different podcast or radio station, and it knows my mood, so maybe kind of change the lighting, seat settings, everything else. I won't even think about it. I'll go and sit in that car in my home. Everything just automatically changes around me, right temperature, everything else, right? And that will just become very, very quickly. For tech that's very easy, it makes our life easier. We just accept it, and it becomes the new normal. So that's the way the world's going to go. But for that world to exist, our current ecosystem is going to have almost perfect data about all of us as individuals, right? So you kind of look that far out, and then you look at how we're going to get to that place from where we are now, and there are many, many paths which get really dystopian very, very quickly. And if you look at me, you can already see this with what's happening in, say, China, with the Uyghurs, and kind of people being kind of tracked on their phones, and kind of like deep personality profiling. But it's basically the state having the image of you, the digital image of you, and they're basically holding their servers. In the West, it's more about kind of Facebook and Google and Amazon and I guess Alibaba, etc. Right? So all of our being basically lives in someone else's silo. You lose your internet connection, that world disappears. And more importantly, all the AI and all the intelligence that's created sits in someone else's silo. So you're then completely beholden to the stuff in that silo. And then if you think about it and go back to first principles, there's a really simple change you can do, which is basically organizing data around us all as individuals, if you can find a way of doing that. So you have a copy of all your data. You should have the best possible copy of all your data, because you can bring it all together from lots of different places and then apply your own AI to it. Then all of a sudden you have this completely distributed, digital, benevolent, beneficent kind of ecosystem. So that's kind of the play. And so I started on that kind of 2011, 2012, kind of like started planning out and set the company out. I was living in Singapore at the time. 2013, then moved to the UK, which is a much better environment to set up the business. And then we've had a couple of, I hate the word pivot, but we've had a couple of pivots and meanders along the way, just trying to find out the market fit. And we were just way ahead of the market as well. So this is around the time of Snowden kind of breaking, when we,
We're now going to put our political risk hats on and go to my conversation with Sam Wilkin, author of History Repeating Why Populists Rise and Governments Fall. And this particular clip is a little bit foreboding as much as it is fascinating, particularly given that we recorded this one back in March of last year.
Does any good ever come of populism? Can there ever be a good populist, or aren't they always just destructive? And that's, I think, people get towards this definition of populists being irresponsible. But the thing I want to point out is most reformers, real radical reformers, have a bit of a populist in them. People
They
who
need to,
really
yeah.
do. They need to, because you're against the system, right? Roosevelt is doing this people's government versus the powers of capital. He's doing this people versus elite element. He's definitely got this populist line going, but he's also intending to be a reformer and to fix things. So I do think there can be certainly reformist populists. Now, that said, I mean, you could pick any number of things that tend to happen with populists, and this is more case study than saying doing a sort of comprehensive analysis of the whole set of populists everywhere. But the two things that tend to happen by populists. One is they tend to get impeached. Huey Long was impeached in his political career, I think at least 4 or 5 times, and then he would always come back. Thaksin Shinawatra in Thailand, impeached any number of times. Juan Perón, the military coup, overthrows him. Not once, at least several times, several attempted coups, and then successful coup, and then another coup. If you're going against the establishment doesn't appreciate it and can overreact in ways that are, in fact, in some ways, it's less a populist who's a danger to democracy, and it's the establishment reaction that's a danger to democracy. I was listening to there's a woman who had just won a national book award, Russian. I cannot remember her name, but she just won a national book award in the United States for a book on Russia. And she said after the election, Obama or Clinton should have declared the election results null and void. And in a way, that is a more likely scenario than Donald Trump doing anything, because you could see a lot of people with a lot of power backing such a move. And so impeachment is a big thing for populists, or irregular removal from office is a big thing for populists. Another big thing is, another big thing is they actually tend to be relatively moderate, relatively centrist.
That's interesting.
It's partly because their messages are not so much about policy, unlike most politicians who campaign on, say, making the education system better, or fixing the roads, fixing the railways, nationalizing industries in the case of Jeremy Corbyn. Most politicians campaign on policy, but populists are often really delivering an anti-system message more than they are delivering a particular policy, or they're pledging to reform the system. And even just by being in Washington to some degree, Trump is shaking up the system. And so I think a lot of people can be happy on that basis, even though his policy record, aside from, on things like Supreme Court justices and things like that, his policy record has not been too remarkable, because, he basically has a hard time getting through anything through the House and Senate. So, yeah, so populists tend to be surprisingly centrist, in government,
and I guess we're seeing that, at least economically, in Brazil, where the markets have kind of gone up, and there's some optimism around, I suppose, at least some economic stability, even though there's a whole range of rhetoric that will get spouted.
Exactly. Markets do tend to love a populist. You saw that same phenomenon when Trump was elected. Markets going up. Markets do tend to love a populist, because, especially a right populist, because they do tend to be pretty establishment. It's, as I said, populists can be real reformers, real radical reformers, but often they try to be establishment in the first, or try to be relatively moderate in the first instance. And the danger can be when you do get into this cycle of impeachment or irregular removal from office, then you get people like Hugo Chavez in Venezuela going the full Castro. I don't think he ever wanted to do that. I think it was when he was up against the wall.
Well, it makes sense, right? Because if you get the establishment that are that's coming after you and impeaching you and all the rest, it just proves your point, and it just galvanizes the support.
Exactly. So it really can play into the hands of a populist if they are irregularly removed. It can. Huey Long, don't want to give this. Don't want to spoiler alert. If you're reading my book, Huey Long was shot. That's really pretty intense, and that kind of ended, thanks to Roosevelt, in part to Roosevelt picking up the populist message. That kind of ended the populist surge in the United States. That when Huey Long was shot. So, I don't want to say that irregular removal never, quote unquote, works, but a lot of the times it hasn't worked, and here I am going to commit the same sin I accused people who wrote How Democracies Die. I'm going to compare the U.S. and cases that really aren't relevant, or aren't directly relevant. But Thaksin Shinawatra in Thailand, this Thai billionaire, gets into power in the wake of a financial crisis. The establishment hates him. No one thinks he's going to win. He wins. He shocks everybody. He appoints all his relatives to high political office. He tries to fire anyone who tries to investigate him. He gets in all sorts of investigations, and it really similar, uncannily similar to the United States situation. Yeah. What happens is he gets thrown out of the country. His friend gets elected. He comes back. He gets thrown out again. His sister gets elected. He comes back. Because every time he was thrown out, that just fed the narrative of his supporters that the system was corrupt, and they were sort of proving the establishment really did control the system in the minds of Thaksin's supporters.
I think you could argue the same thing with Juan Perón, and the legend of Juan Perón, because the same sort of thing happened, and you're just creating more support and galvanizing the base. So
exactly.
That's interesting.
And it's crucial for populists to do that, to have that kind of, Juan Perón, one of his famous quotes was, people say the Peronist movement is a centrist movement. That's a grave error. Peronism is neither left nor right nor center, which sounds insane. But he's saying the thing that drives my support is this anti-system message, not this message about leftist policies or centrist policies or right-wing policies. It's this anti-system message. And I'm not left, right, or center. I'm against the whole thing. And to some extent, that any kind of irregular removal from office just feeds that kind of populist support. Right.
So in some ways, if you're if you're concerned about Trump in the U.S., that you're much rather, it might sound counterintuitive, but just to let him fizzle out and kind of fail, as opposed to impeach him.
Exactly.
Yeah, it sounds counterintuitive, but yeah, if you are anti-Trump, that might be you might want to pivot.
I think so. I mean, admittedly, most of the cases I've been referring to that tell you this is we've been referring to that most tell you this is a bad idea are from emerging markets, and there's a problem with a lot of the commentary on populism. Is populism vanished from the earth? And that didn't vanish from the earth. It vanished from the advanced economies of the U.S. and Europe in the 1930s, and for the last 50 years, we don't have successful policy. One or two really don't. So the cases everyone kind of keeps coming back to are these emerging market cases where you have had populists over the past few years, and it is really hard to say how relevant these cases are to our current condition. But yeah, I would say that impeaching Trump is a really big risk.
We are now firmly in China's century. This next clip is from my conversation from episode 102 with Daniel Wagner about his book, China Vision.
I think what's happening, Ben, is that it is creating a de facto alternative order. And I don't think that means that the world order as we've known it in the post-World War II era is about to collapse. My suggestion in the book is that there will be, if not a competing, a sort of alternative approach to world order that might have less in the way of compliance concerns, less in the way of governance, less in the way of rule of law. And that's, I think, very consistent with the world that the Chinese government might like to see. because it's accustomed, of course, to being able to do what it wants, where it wants, how it wants, etc. And in the international arena, that's generally not the way things are supposed to work. So I don't think we're going to see a collapse of the existing world order, but we're certainly already seeing a weakening of it. And it's gradually being influenced by, if not replaced by, this alternative order that I'm talking about, which does not really portend some very good things in the longer term. So we've got this world order that includes now this nexus between nationalism and populism and strongmen rulers, and that seems to be growing, not weakening. And of course, if you think about this as a pendulum, that you go from liberal democracy to more authoritarian kinds of governments throughout history, and how that's likely to continue to repeat itself in the future, you could say this is just the natural order of things. But I also think that the Chinese government thinks that this is, in a way, a version, if you will, of the American manifest destiny, in the sense that, well, 150 years ago and hundreds of years prior to that, it was either India or China that was the world's most important and largest economy. And, the U.S. and some of the other Western countries are just sort of the new kids on the block. And the Chinese perceive that they're picking up the mantle where they left off 150 or so years ago. And I think that's legitimate. Their frame of reference is very, very different. And it is tainted, if you will, but certainly influenced by what they refer to as their century of humiliation, where they were basically berated or, in some cases, invaded by foreign powers with little ability to do anything about it. And they're bound and determined not to let that happen again.
Let's talk a little bit about some of the things that you mentioned in the book around China and the way it conducts warfare. And you talk about this policy or these tactics known as the assassin's mace. I love that. I love these words, right? Assassin's mace. And what that means. And you talk about, well, it's all kinds of things. It's manipulating foreign media, flooding. It says here, flooding enemy countries with drugs, controlling the markets for natural resources, joining international bodies so as to be in a position to bend them to one's will, and engaging in cyber warfare. And you talk about this as a doctrine that was ahead of its time. And you read something like that and you think, well, that's just, that's sinister, and that's, how dare they, that's terrible, etc. At the same time, the United States has done all kinds of things in terms of intervening in states that they didn't, whose governments they didn't see eye to eye with, whether we're talking about Iran or countries in Central America or a country that we just talked about, Ecuador. So what's the difference here?
Well, from the Chinese perspective, there is something called unrestricted warfare, which means do whatever you need to get the job done. And they've applied this in the political and economic and military arenas. So, you might say, well, there's a code of conduct, written or unwritten, that you don't, blatantly steal other people's intellectual property, et cetera. But from the Chinese perspective, they're saying, well, why not?
Right. Yeah.
If I can get my hands on it, and if you're dumb enough not to have the right security in place to keep me from getting it, then why shouldn't I? And what they're doing is taking this approach to sort of leapfrog ahead in areas where they are lagging behind. And so whether it's the construction of an aircraft carrier or these, cutting-edge fighter aircraft, et cetera, it'll take them a long time to do all this stuff from scratch. But if they can steal the plans, well, they get it a lot sooner. And to Xi's credit, I mean, he's got vision. He's got the long-term future in mind, and of course, being president for life, you probably should have the long-term future in mind. Yeah. So he actually deserves credit, I think. We in the West, we might criticize the tactics, but from their perspective, it's like, dude, get out of my way, I'm coming through. So that's sort of how I look at it.
Let's talk social media, information, disinformation, and Facebook. This is from episode 117 with Paul-Olivier Dehaye.
So the real question is whether this targeting can actually have an effect on the spread of information on social media. And I think it can. This is an entire field of digital marketing, growth hacking, whatever you want to call it. How do you get something viral? The main difference is that people don't seem to grasp the consequence of it. So ask yourself, when is the last time you shared with your friends a toothpaste ad? You probably have never done it.
No.
But you might have shared political content.
Sure.
Right? So the amount of leverage, the amount of persuasion you need to have to encourage someone to reshare political content on social media is much, much, much lower than any other content, probably.
Right.
And we don't exactly know how that works, how the psychology of it works. We don't exactly know. But we know that every 4 years, if you look at the US, there's this massive stress test on platforms algorithms, the dampening on those algorithms, the detection of problems. There are massive stress tests because we suddenly have highly engaging content and a lot of money thrown behind it. And it's unprecedented from election to election. And we just don't know how platforms deal with that. And in 2016, they certainly were not prepared. But we could see some signs beforehand that there might have been problems there. And I see 3 signs. What happened with listicles, with clickbait, and with the ice bucket challenge.
Okay.
So they don't exactly have the same dynamics behind, but basically at some point the algorithm thought, well, everyone wants to see clickbait. Let's just show clickbait to everyone. Right? So the feed was overrun, the news feed was overrun with that type of content because the algorithm could detect that something was clickbait because of the way the headline was written or whatever it was. And people clicked on it. So sure, I'll show you more of that. And as a result, everyone saw it. Same thing with listicles, 7 things you will never believe about so-and-so, right? So that happened. But my point is that this required manual correction, manual input from engineers who went in and, found out why this was happening and corrected it. And the other thing was the ice bucket challenge, which, this challenge to friends to throw a bucket of water on top of yourself. But that probably... So first of all, in the conception of the thing from the start, it had the viral effect, but also it was using video at a time where Facebook was encouraging to use video. So that also helped promote it in the feed. Right. So again, this sort of overwhelmed the algorithms for a little while and just affected the content that everyone would see.
Right. And I guess it's kind of an exponential growth thing where the more it gets shared, the more it's shared, the more it gets shared, and there's only so many things in your feed that you can focus on. So the amount of clicks and shares of certain type of content to other content is the difference is massive, isn't it?
Yeah, but there's another step in there that I don't think you've made explicit. It's the less it gets filtered, right? So there's only so much space. There's only so much space in your feed. If you think that on Facebook you see everything that your friends post and everything, that's not true.
Right.
There is a high filter being exercised there, and that's maybe where there is the most impact. Is Facebook has to decide which content to show you, and if suddenly there is ice bucket challenges being shared here and there everywhere, and this is the only thing that gets through in among a lot of other content, right? Then from your perspective, it looks like that's all that is circulating on the feed. That is all that is circulating on Facebook.
Right.
But it's far from the truth. But it's just what Facebook filters or doesn't.
And it feels like that's what's going on in the world. It's just the ice bucket challenge, or that's the majority of what's going on in the world. And of course, what Facebook is trying to do is just get you back spending as much time on that platform as possible.
Yes. So we generate as much revenue, of course.
Yeah.
person per person, and this is a combination of maintaining you on the platform, showing you content that they get paid for, so ads in other words, and not too much, because of course if they show you too much you'll leave, right? So it's this, they have to optimize for this right balance. It's a bit like, you know, those sitcoms where it's interrupted every 9 minutes for an ad, that's fine. If it's interrupted every 3 minutes for an ad, then you just give up and you go do something else. Well, they can optimize for this very, very much. They can measure every single item on your newsfeed is based on this calculation, basically.
Mm-hmm. And let's go back to the non-filtered part, because that's where you get into fake news, and it's amazing what things get shared that are totally don't have much basis or any basis in fact, and even just a little modicum of critical thinking on something that's political, and you might think, you know, why in the world do people believe this? but it's interesting that. But it's
actually it. I mean, there is definitely an element of, yes, this content is ludicrous. Why do people believe it? Mm-hmm. But you cannot overlook the filter either. Mm-hmm. I mean, for something that appears ludicrous to you, and that someone gullible will immediately accept, there is a whole bunch of people in between that are like, oh, that's odd.
Right.
That's really odd. Wait a minute. I don't believe it, but I'll read it.
Right.
So they will click on this, right? They will look at it, and they will engage with that content. And maybe afterwards they will comment and say, well, this is completely crap, or whatever they want to say, right? And it could very well be that this is all perceived as great. People engage on the platform. Wow, we managed to get them more here. You know, so we're at a stage where information circulates with rules, with physics that we don't fully know, because it's controlled entirely by the platform. And the physics is not quite the same for all of us, but it's kind of contagious, right? So it gets very complicated to understand the dynamics. And our relation to information is going to be different for all of us, but we have to account for it in order to really know ourselves, how we stand. It's a bit like a contagious disease, right? And vaccines. Like you're never quite sure whether your vaccine has expired or not, and you're never quite sure that people around you have been vaccinated in the first place, or how the vaccination actually was. But there is definitely contagion effects. So that's the situation right now.
Right. How in your estimation has Facebook been responding to all of this, and whether or not that's satisfactory?
I think they've been shooting themselves in the right foot, then the left foot.
Okay.
Then they had to look for another foot to shoot in, because they just keep on making mistakes. I mean, they are set in one business model, of course. It's a big ship and everything. And they're resisting so many calls for transparency that are just going to bite them back very, very heavily. And I think it's really stupid. I mean, they could just own it. They could just own what they're doing and say, okay, this is how it works. This is what we have. And these are the dynamics we're observing of influence on the platform and everything. But they're not in that mode, really. There's probably people inside that want to do that. Mm-hmm. But there is also a huge amount of corporate layer, of PR, of legal, and so on, that's preventing them from doing this. And in the end, that's hurting the company as well. That's hurting the image of the company.
Right. Let's get into that just a little bit. So you think it stems from wanting to protect the intellectual property associated with their algorithms and techniques? Is that what you would hypothesize?
Maybe, but I think it's just it stems from a disconnect.
Okay.
Just from a disconnect, like they don't understand from their vantage point, they don't understand that they need help from outside. Mm-hmm. They don't understand that this help could actually be beneficial, and they will never be able to do the same thing because they are in, if you are in such position of absolute power, as soon as something goes wrong, it's your fault. But if you share some of that power, if you try to distribute it wisely, then you're collectively responsible, or collectively there is some form of solidarity, right? So to be concrete, I mean, if Facebook was being more transparent in ways that could help journalists detect disinformation patterns or use of targeting for nefarious purposes and all of those things, sure, it might be uncomfortable for some of their clients, but mostly the bad clients, mostly the bad actors. And that's basically pure costs on their side that they've externalized to journalists, and that in doing so, they've acted, in the responsible way. Instead, they're closing up from everywhere, and, well, implicitly, they are assuming all the responsibility. And it keeps on blowing up in their face.
All right, up next is our final clip of this best of two-part series. And I wanted to send us out on a high note. So here is Jeremy Gilley, founder of Peace One Day.
So let's talk about cynicism for a moment.
Yeah.
You get the cynic say, well, you're going against everything that history has ever taught us. You're going against everything that human nature is all about. Who do you think you are? But
yeah, so let's kind of so that thought that you just said, of course, it would be very true, is actually why we would, of course, destroy ourselves, right? Imagine that what you just said was true.
Yeah.
Imagine there was somebody who actually thought that what you've just said was right.
Yeah.
And there is, right? And therefore so we may as well accept where we're heading if your statement was just true then. But we can turn that around if there are people who think like that.
Yeah.
Those people have got to understand that the suffering, they are a consequence of the mountain never being climbed. Because the cynic says you can't stop the fighting in Afghanistan. Oh, but we just did.
You did.
And 1.4 million people got the polio vaccination. So you would have rather they didn't. Interesting cynicism.
Yeah.
It kills people. It kills people, cynicism.
Yeah.
Kills people.
Yeah.
It stops things from happening.
Yeah.
And that's because they don't actually want to do anything themselves. So if they remain cynical, they feel good, right? Because I don't have to do anything.
Interesting.
Yeah? The cynic is doing that because he actually or she does not want to get involved. So poo-poo it, and therefore I don't have to do anything, do I? Great, so let's get on ripping the world apart and stuffing as much money as I can in my pocket.
Yeah, that's powerful. That's interesting.
Yeah, it's just...
Well, I think that's why, for me, the Afghanistan thing was so... they if you want to make change happen, you go after something that's difficult, not something that's easy. It would have been pretty easy for you to do something in, Sweden or something, right? But pick Goma, pick Afghanistan, pick these places, because then it's, as you say, the cynics will just say, "Oh, we just did." If you walked up to somebody and say, who didn't know anything about you, and say, what if we go to Afghanistan, we'll have a day of peace and Taliban, there's no fighting and blah, 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 and then we'll vaccinate 1.4 million or something along those lines. And the cynic might say, you can't do that. Well, we did.
Yeah.
That's how you make change happen, isn't it?
Yeah, you do. So you make change happen. Yeah, definitely. I mean, thank God. And that's why, look, I don't know, mate, I'm still trying to make sense of everything.
Yeah.
I mean, I really am freaked out by everything.
What are you freaked out about?
Listen, man, I mean, it's just too much to go into, isn't it? But there's just so much behaviour that I'm just like, wow, I just actually don't understand all of this. So I'm just going to just gun it, just do the best I can.
So what's the next thing? What's the next?
Well,
you've got 20th anniversary coming up.
Yeah, we've got 20th anniversary coming up, which I'm immensely excited. I really hope that people, visit peaceoneday.org and please go to our social media, follow our social media. It helps massively. The numbers are everything. But more importantly, what we've got coming up is in a few months' time. We want to see people all over the world bringing their families together. I mean, what a wonderful thing, right? I mean, just right there. If you know there's a day of peace, just bring the family together. There might be some, a son you're not talking to, or a father you're not talking to, or a mum, or whatever, or a sister you haven't seen for a while, or whatever it might be. In families, there's all sorts of strange things that go on. We get it. Families, it's just like a mirror of the wider world, and the whole thing's all interrelated, isn't it? So we've got this opportunity as individuals to really come and make a real massive difference in the world of peace. And the amazing thing is that just starts with you and the family, right? It's beautiful. So I think everyone's just, do what you can do. That's what's coming up. That's what I want to say. Okay, in terms of what we're doing to mobilise, the hashtag Silent Non-Violence campaign is very important. The 20-year celebration is very important. People will be able to watch that celebration, which is going to have an amazing panel on domestic abuse in the morning, and then we're going to have then we're doing a panel on cyber non-violence, and then we're doing this amazing thing with some of the most important actors in the world, and then we're doing an incredible celebration in the evening with films and speeches and la-di-da-di-da, and loads of social media. And I think we'll probably see the greatest observance on this day, that we've ever seen this year, for sure. And we're going to measure in a more calculated and more analytical, kind of intellectual, kind of techie way that we've ever done. Look at those words. They don't really all go together, but anyway, you know what I'm saying. But we're really getting into the measurement of the 21st of September.
So is that, for example, going on to social media and just say, well, let's look at, because you can do this sort of negative posts versus positive posts versus the incidents of cyberbullying or whatever. Is that kind of thing?
Listen, that's decreasing negativity and it's increasing positivity on the Twitter. Because of what we've said about human beings' behaviour, we've got to somehow, where does this begin? And it can start with a simple act. A long journey starts with one step, doesn't it? And peace can start with one day. And if you build a house, it starts with one brick, right? So I just really hope what it's all about for me and what's next for me is trying to institutionalize this day. I really want everyone to know about it. I believe that we can tell 3 billion people by 2025 for sure, right? That they'll know that it's the day of peace. At that point, it becomes embedded in the culture. And at that point, naturally things change in school, and naturally humanitarian assistance, and naturally we will pray, and naturally we will come together as families, and we will come together as countries, and we will go, oh, that felt nice. I just made friends with a family member I hadn't seen in years on that day of peace. And that's just totally changed the quality of my family's life. And out of there, you can come at things a little bit differently and a bit stronger and have a bit more hope. And the kids of those families go, well, shit, actually, we don't need to be divided. And this feels really nice. And then a little person has a thought like Greta, who wants to stand outside of school with a billboard on a Friday that's going to win the Nobel Peace Prize. That's what it's all about. It's about us changing our feelings and going, wow, and then a little person gets a sense of that and then has belief and hope that things can be different and the world changes, because Gandhi did it and Martin Luther King did it and Rosa Parks did it. That's what it's all about.
That concludes our 2-part Best of 2019 of All Things Risk. And before we go, 3 things. Number 1, thank you for listening and for following All Things Risk. I started this podcast 3 years ago, and it's changed my life in the most positive of ways. And I couldn't have done it without my amazing guests. And I also could not have done it without you, the listener. And doing a podcast like this is a big commitment. I sometimes question why I do it, but then I get a message or something positive in terms of feedback that serves as a great reminder as to why I started this show. I read every single message you send, and I get a boost from every single like and share of the podcast. So thank you very, very much. Secondly, if you want to support All Things Risk, the best way, and still the best way to do so, is to share the show and to give us a positive rating or review wherever you get your podcasts. And we're actually quite light on these. I've not invested in any mechanism to game these types of reviews, although that can be done, but I will not do so. So if you could help us out by doing that, I'd be extremely grateful. It's quick and it's free. And finally, I wish you all the very best for for 2020 and beyond. We've got some great content in store for this year, so please join us. And to that end, we'll be back in a few days. Until then, and as always, don't forget, risk is life.